So let me get started. I have an epigraph for this talk, which comes from a book by a biologist, Daniel Botkin. And he says, nature in the 21st century will be a nature that we make. The question is the degree to which this molding will be intentional or unintentional, desirable or undesirable. And this comes from a book titled Discordant Harmonies, A New Ecology for the 21st Century. And I really, really recommend this book. I wanted to show it to you, and if you want to take a look at it later, you're most welcome to do it. I think it's a great book because it's written from a biologist, so it's written from the perspective of someone who is a scientist, who has been involved in environmentalism for a long time, but at the same time with someone with a great awareness of the importance of literature, the importance of language for how we understand our place among other facts on this planet. So I think it's a really, really good book for people in the humanities. So I start. In a book titled In Human Nature, Sociable Life on a Dynamic Planet, published 3 years ago, Nigel Clarke formulated the following opinion. The awareness that humankind has grown into a preeminent force in planetary nature, and all the associated questions about how to deal with this situation, is undoubtedly one of the most momentous events our species has ever had to cope with. Well, we all know what the most urgent problems are: the pollution of water, the lack of drinking water in many parts of the world, fast extinction of many species of animals and plants, garbage, including toxic waste and electronic garbage that's very difficult to get rid of, and last but not least, the impact of human activities on the Earth's climate, that is to say, simply global warming. If we consider this last fact, global warming, anthropogenic climate change, then we can conclude that there is no place left on this planet where nature, whatever that means, would exist in a state that has not been modified by human civilization. In 1989, that is already 25 years ago, the American environmentalist Bill McKibben published a book under the somewhat apocalyptic title, The End of Nature, which was considered to be the first book about global warming addressed to the popular audience. And in that book he wrote, an idea, a relationship, can go extinct, just like an animal or a plant. The idea in this case is nature, the separate and wild province, the world apart from man, to which he adapted, under whose rules he was born and died. And of course the generic he, or man, or mankind, I won't be commenting on this every time, for every single quotation. We know by now, yes, that humankind also includes women, so I'm just going to say it once. But okay, so that's McKibben. McKibben's diagnosis was perhaps a bit too dramatic, and his understanding of the word nature a little anachronistic. If we have time at the end, then I'd like to go back to this, to the question of the word nature, to what it means and to why this word can actually be quite problematic from the perspective of ecology. But for now, we just think about the basic fact, the heart of the matter, which is this. Humans are exerting an influence on the life-supporting systems of this planet, and this influence is, quite often, quite destructive. In order to describe the scope of our impact on the Earth, the biologist Eugene Sturmer coined the term the Anthropocene, which was later made popular by the Nobel Prize laureate Paul Crutzen. In the year 2000, Crutzen and Sturmer argued that the geological epoch in which we live should be referred to as the Anthropocene because human activities since the Industrial Revolution have transformed the oceans, the atmosphere and the surface of the Earth as profoundly as the natural catastrophes which defined the previous geological eras. Crutzen and Sturmer remind us that during the last 300 years, there has been a tenfold increase of the human population, accompanied by an equally intense increase in the numbers of cattle. From 30 to 50% of the surface of the Earth has been transformed as a result of activities such as agriculture and industry. It is estimated that as a result of human activities, species extinction in some parts of the world happens 1,000 times more quickly than it would without human intervention. So, we can congratulate ourselves because as a species, which enthusiastically named itself Homo sapiens, we have reached the stages of a geological cataclysm relatively quickly. But what perhaps differs us from previous cataclysms is that, at least in theory, we can become aware of what we're doing, of what we are and where we're going, and we can maybe attempt to understand the nature of our relationship with the non-human elements of the world, and perhaps we can sort of consciously decide about what it is that we want to do with this situation. So we have at least, as a potentiality, the ability to observe the consequences of our actions and sometimes even learn from our mistakes. For Crutzen and Sturmer, the Anthropocene is primarily a challenge. They write, without major catastrophes like an enormous volcanic eruption, an unexpected epidemic, a large-scale nuclear war, an asteroid impact, a new ice age, or continued plundering of Earth's resources by partially still primitive technology, mankind, again, will remain a major geological force for many millennia, maybe millions of years to come. To develop a worldwide accepted strategy leading to sustainability of ecosystems against human-induced stresses will be one of the great future tasks of mankind, requiring intensive research efforts and wise application of the knowledge thus acquired. So what they have in mind when they speak about the Anthropocene as a challenge to human thought, because that's primarily how they want to define it, and I like their text because it's not as apocalyptic as McKibben, because I don't really like this apocalyptical strain in environmentalism, which is just saying, you know, it's over, we have ruined it, and now we will be punished for it. So it's much better to think about, somehow I find the ecologists who speak about the current situation, and also about the impact of human beings on this planet, as also proving that we are extremely powerful. Yes, because it also proves that we are extremely powerful as a collectivity. So I like this idea that the Anthropocene is primarily a challenge. And for these two authors, this challenge, this is a technological challenge, as they have in mind mostly technological knowledge. But for other writers and for myself, and this is actually one of the major premises behind what I'm trying to articulate here, this challenge also applies to the humanities. Lawrence Buell, one of the pioneers of the trend in literary studies known as eco-criticism, says, the ecological crisis is the crisis of the imagination. According to Buell and many other eco-critics, human destructiveness is a result, at least in part, of the wrong ideas we have about the natural environment. We have the technology. What we lack is the imagination to understand the crisis and to undertake proper action. The poet W.S. Merwin formulated the same thought even more radically, saying, only the imagination can save us. These statements by Buell and Merwin suggest that the condition of the planet, which many of us find disquieting, results not so much from the limitations of technical nature or technological nature, but rather from the lack of a deep intuitive understanding of our proper place in the world, a deep empathic response to the situation that might motivate a transformation of our lives. So in other words, to put it very simply, we have a lot of theoretical knowledge. Yes, we have a lot of science, and that's extremely important, but you know how it works. Theoretical knowledge does not always easily translate into what we do, into how we actually act, and I think everybody knows that from their own lives, yes? How many times you actually know what you should do, yes, and then you end up doing the exact opposite, yes? So I think, that's we can easily relate to this. If we wanted to be more academic, and perhaps more pessimist, then we could say, we could refer to Slavoj Žižek, who a few years ago, Žižek had this idea that in contemporary times we live in the age when cynicism has become the dominant form of ideology, yes, cynicism as an ideology. And Žižek refers to Marx. Marx is a very simple definition of ideology that comes from the Capital is this: they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. Yes, that's ideology. They don't know what they're doing. Now, for Žižek turns it around and he says, they do know, or we do know what we're doing, and we're still doing it. Yes, and that's the definition of cynicism as an ideology. We do know what we're doing, yet we're still doing it. So that's a pessimistic way to put it. Yes, if that's the dominant ideology of our times, we know perfectly well what we're doing, we're still doing it, and then that's kind of bad news. Yes, it's hard to think about what we might do with it. But better news is coming from elsewhere. Yes, and actually some good news is coming from science. which, and especially the new discoveries in neuroscience, which is beginning to actually find a lot of support for what post-structuralist thought was saying about, you know, the nature of human subjectivity being relational, being actually dependent on others. And the discovery, especially of mirror neurons, suggests, this is perhaps a little bit overstated, that humans might actually be hardwired for empathy. I can't go into it right now because it would take too long, yes, but apparently there is a biological base for empathy in human beings and also in other primates and in some other animals as well. And one really wonderful thing that comes out of these studies is that empathy is actually connected with a sense of self. So in other words, otherness and selfhood are biologically, strictly connected in the brain. What can be inferred from this is that self-preservation and helping other beings actually stem from the same biological sources. So there's no conflict, yes, somehow biologically speaking, between self-preservation and cooperation with other beings. And this is something that goes against the traditional understandings of Darwinian theory of evolution. So I think that's quite a wonderful new area of studies that opens up in, for example, neurobiology. One wonderful thing about it is that it confirms the intuitions of philosophers such as Spinoza, for example. Spinoza would say that the only feasible grounds for ethics is conatus, which is the drive to exist. Yes, so our own desire to exist, our own drive to be, is the only possible grounds for ethics. And here it turns out that this might actually have a certain biological grounding. So who knows, maybe this instinct for self-preservation and empathy will actually win out in us. However, when we come to this point that we've been discussing, the problem of how to translate knowledge into the transformation of our lives is the problem of how to reach a deep understanding of the situation, of how to make facts somehow register more deeply generally in people's minds. This is when we come to the necessity of a dialogue between science and the humanities. The necessity to overcome the division of human knowledge into disciplines and to create more, let's say, holistic approaches to learning and also to life, to the understanding of our place, of our relationships with our environments. Art definitely needs science. Artists and poets have always been interested in science, always. It's very clear that poetry needs science. That's very clear. If someone wants to write poems about landscapes or animals, then they should study those things first. You know, the poet Gary Snyder, the poet environmentalist Gary Snyder in the United States, he has this very simple statement of poetics. He says the first rule for a poem is no bullshit. So I think that's very important. But on the other hand, science also needs poetry, or science also needs art, because it needs imagination and intuition and playfulness, and that's the domain of the arts. The biologist that I have already mentioned, this Daniel Botkin, he argues that one of the greatest obstacles on the way to dealing with the current problems is constituted by the anachronistic beliefs about non-human nature that we have. And he gives many examples of situations when the attachment to some idea was stronger than the empirically experienced reality. Yes, so somehow humans have this tendency to cling to ideas, to cling to fictions very strongly, yes? And this happens quite often in science. Science quickly solidifies into dogma, and these scientific dogmas are very hard to uproot, yes? So that's one of the problems that science is often facing, that because of clinging to certain fictions, to certain ideas or ideologies, the progress of science is deterred. There's a saying among scientists that the progress in science happens one funeral at a time. Yes? So the hardest thing is to get rid of the obsolete ideas and open up and ask new questions, yes, and to be able to not know, yes, and that's how science needs poetry and the imagination and the playfulness and the questioning, yes, to be able to think outside of the box. Another way in which science needs art, and perhaps especially poetry, is to be able to communicate its findings. And this is, you have a link there on the handout to a report from University College London, there was a committee there for communicating climate change, and I'm giving you a link to a report that they prepared about what they think is one of the most pressing environmental problems of today. And this is the problem of precisely how to communicate climate science to the general audience. Because they feel that that's the most important problem somehow, yes, that it doesn't register, that people don't understand or don't want to know, that there are facts, yes, that we have facts, we have theoretical knowledge, but nothing is happening. It's just not registering deeply enough. So there is a feeling on both sides that it's hard time, on both sides, that is on the side of the so-called hard sciences and on the side of the humanities, that it's hard time to end this compartmentalization of human knowledge and activities, which is actually one of the central aspects of Western instrumental rationality, and to begin to, but it's not working out. Yes, this instrumental rationality which divides knowledge into disciplines, right now it's not working out, so there's a strong sense among both the scientists and the artists that we need a greater, that we need a more profound dialogue, and that we need to join the energies, yes, that come from these various disciplines. So now I'd like to move on to the discussion of poetics, and I'd like to explain what poetry might have to do with ecology. So first, the meaning of the word ecology. This is quite obvious, I think, to most of you. The word ecology derives from two Greek words, oikos and logos. And I think, even though it's well known, I think it's always worth to remember this, that the etymology for the word ecology is precisely this, oikos and logos. Oikos means household, a dwelling place, a home, yes, whereas logos means knowledge. So literally, ecology means the understanding of the household. Yes, it's the understanding of our home. So the science of ecology is simply about knowing, it's simply about the understanding of the environment, of the home that we have. It's morally neutral term. Yes, it does not involve any morality. And then the word poetry. Oh, I'm sorry. This is not working out, but I'll just explain. The word poetry comes from the Greek, from another Greek word, that's poiesis. And again, I don't have the time to go into a detailed explanation of how this word evolved. Yes, but poiesis, which was first used as a verb rather than as a noun, means to make, to create. It's about making. So poiesis is making. Maybe I'll quote what I couldn't show. The verb, not the noun, was prominent in usage first. In the context of poetry, the substantive poietes, poet, was long more common than the abstract noun poiesis. Indeed, the art of poetry as such was often denoted as poietique, from which the discipline of poetics obtains its name. In general usage, the verb form poiein, which is infinitive of poieo, retained as primary meaning an act of formation and transformation of matter in the cosmic sphere in relation to time. The suffix poiesis appears also in words related to generation and self-generation of living organisms and other systems. So poiesis is a making. And poiesis is a making. But I think what's crucial is that we can understand this making less in technical terms, because the etymology of the word poiesis actually allows for this understanding. The etymology and the history of how the word poiesis has been used allows for a more spiritual or existential understanding. And that's what I would like to suggest, or that's what I would like to propose, to understand poiesis as the making of ourselves, and the making of our world. These two things are interconnected, obviously. All creatures create worlds insofar as they interact with their environments. Here, a new science of biosemiotics speaks about that, speaks about the relationships between organisms and their environments as a kind of communication, as various languages, as world makings, precisely. So we humans also make our world. Yes, we make our world, we have our own poiesis. Yes, now if we combine poiesis with oikos, so ecopoetics, etymologically that would be oikos, and poiesis, that would be the making of a home. And that's how I'd like to understand the term ecopoetics, yes? Ecopoetics would, in this sense, would be not just writing poetry, even though poetry does play an important role or perhaps even a privileged role in this act of spiritual homemaking. But I would like to understand ecopoetics as a practice, more broadly, as a practice of making a home. At this moment, the only home that we have is the planet Earth. And of course, it would be wonderful to have other homes on other planets, and perhaps one day we will, but right now, for the time being, we're here, this is the home. And now the question is, how do we make a home here? It's a question of style, in fact. I'm referring a little bit to Gary Snyder, because it's his also idea, that this whole ecology thing is a question of good manners, yes? So to me, also, I'd like to turn this sort of into an aesthetic question. How do we make a home here? What is our style, yes? What is our style of making a home on this planet? Do we want to say, this is my land, yes, my earth, I own it, I'm just going to cling to my ideas and to my stuff and then kill everybody, human or non-human, who's going to stand in my way? Is this my style? Or is my style, my poiesis, a different kind of style in which I kind of accept the fact that we share this home with other beings, non-human beings? I very much like the expression non-humans because it could include plants and animals and landscapes. It could also include artificial things, not necessarily just natural things. And it could also include aliens, if they ever came, yes? A creature from other planets. Doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, just non-human beings. So this is the question to me of ecopoetics, the style. It's a stylistic question. How do we make a home here? And of course we use also poetry. We use also poetry to make a home on this planet. And just one more little thing which I wanted to mention is that the word empathy. Actually, the English word empathy the English word empathy was coined on the basis of some Greek words as a translation of the German word Einfühlung, yes, more or less, yes. And the German word was actually used in the context of the psychology of aesthetic response. So, in other words, the German word for empathy, for which the English word empathy is a translation, was used in the context of aesthetics. So this is the source of the English word empathy. It's aesthetics. It's an aesthetic response to an artwork. Okay, so we come back to the style. Yes, we come back to the style of homemaking, to the style of poiesis. And I'm going to give you a quote from Walden. Everybody knows Thoreau. Actually, you have a longer quote on the handout. Maybe I won't read the whole thing. It's about Thoreau planting beans. Yes, Thoreau is living in Walden Woods, and he decides to plant some beans, yes, because he wants to have beans, and that happens, yes. For human beings, sometimes plant things because they want food. And now the question is how we do it. And I like the poetics of this fragment because Thoreau, when he writes about it, he says that his desire was to make the yellow soil express its summer thought in bean leaves and blossoms rather than in wormwood and piper and millet grass. That he wanted to make the earth say beans instead of grass. Yes, that he wanted to make the earth say beans instead of grass. That was my daily work, Thoreau says. So of course he uses the earth. Yes, he plants the beans and so on and so forth. But what's interesting here is that he does not put it in this instrumental language here, but rather his language or his poetics. He does not say this soil merely exists for my profit, but rather he builds a home on the basis of a kind of a conversation, of a kind of a dialogue with the non-human entity, in this case, some piece of landscape, some piece of soil, yes? It expresses itself. So the beans, which we are going to use, obviously, because, we are animals and we eat things, but they are not just, we don't make them how we want it, but they are an expression, yes, of some non-human entity. Some non-human entity, in this case, a piece of land, a piece of soil, expresses itself through these beans. So there's a kind of a dialogue. So if I wanted to somehow characterize this non-instrumental poetics in relation to non-human entities, it would involve the following things. So So the assumption that non-humans also have a subjectivity, a kind of subjectivity, yes, we know that it's true for some animals that they really are subject, they really have a sense of self, yes, just like we do. For some other, it's probably not the case, they don't have the sense of self like we do, but they also have a subjectivity in the sense that they are entities that exist and act independently of our imagination, of our expectations, and so on and so forth. That they are